Okay, great. Thanks a lot. Hello, everyone. This is my second year attending NADP, and it's been great to see what's being done with deposition and critical loads, and to join in the CLAD group. So I'm excited to share with you the work we have been doing in Canada at a national scale in critical loads mapping. You've probably seen some version of the Canada-wide critical load map from when Amanda Cole presented on the Adagio project a couple of years ago. And I'd like to describe to you the overall methodology and results of the critical loads mapping. While the methods follow conventional critical load mapping techniques, I think the estimation of a couple of the input parameters is kind of creative, and it might be of interest to other people making critical loads maps. Just an intro for those who are unfamiliar with the critical loads concept. The classical definition coined by Nielsen and Grenfeld is a quantitative estimate of an exposure to one or more pollutants below which significant harmful effects on specified sensitive elements of the environment do not occur according to present knowledge. But I really like Amanda Cole's title for a poster she made, How Much Acidic Deposition is Too Much? I think that's a really great and simple explanation of critical loads. It's a tool that's been used for decades to inform policy about acidic deposition to help mitigate damage to ecosystems from
Hazel, could you turn down your volume a little bit? I'm sorry to interrupt you. We're just getting a little bit of echo in the room, and that might help.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Your speaker volume, that is. Thank you.
Okay. I think I have to. How is that? Is that a little better?
No, it doesn't sound better, but we're not going to spend a lot of time troubleshooting this, so.
Okay, I'll try and speak softer. Is that better?
You're doing fine. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Today, I'm just going to talk about terrestrial critical loads of acidity. To start with some background, Canada has a history of regional critical load assessments for terrestrial critical loads. Those are generally at the provincial level. Many of these were presented in the 2008 National Picture of Acid Deposition, Critical Loads for Forest Soils in Canada report. These maps were presented together to form a multi-province map of forest soil critical loads and exceedance using modeled sulfur and nitrogen from 1994 to 1998 and 2002. With different approaches to critical load calculations and differences in resolution and alignment, however, interprovincial comparison is a bit problematic. Also, with Arctic regions undergoing dramatic warming and Arctic marine traffic increasing, it seems important to extend critical loads to those regions as well. And many of these unmapped areas contain large point sources of emissions, which may also be of concern. So there remains a need for a nationally consistent critical load map to which updates and model deposition can be applied. Some of the barriers to improving and extending these maps in the past have been just a lack of mapped input data or data that was too coarse. We have a lot of new data, new high-resolution input maps, and increased computational ability now that we can use to improve the terrestrial critical maps for Canada. The simple mass balance model is the established model for estimating terrestrial critical loads by the conventional long-range transport of atmospheric pollutants. Briefly, the simple mass balance model takes into account sources and sinks of acidity and alkalinity in the system. Most of the difficulty in applying the model comes from sourcing or estimating the input parameters. I wanted to illustrate here how many input layers go into producing the main input parameters. I've simplified it a little bit even. Some of the major ones I want to highlight in this presentation include the base cation weathering rate, base cation deposition, nutrient uptake, and the selection of the chemical criteria for damage. The simple mass balance applies to natural and semi-natural ecosystems, so agricultural regions are broadly removed from the maps. And the maps are further limited to mineral soils only. Organic soils defined as 30% organic matter or more were removed. Adaptations to simple mass balance model to include organic soils across the country that we try to have in in Canada so far. So that's an area of future work. The maps are created at 250 meters, which matches most of the input resolutions. Processing is done in R, which allows us to easily update any of the input parameters. Just an illustration for those who are unfamiliar with terrestrial critical load calculations. They aren't just one value, but rather a function of 3 different values, or in our case, 3 different maps. CL max S, the maximum sulfur-based critical load, CL min N, which is the amount of nitrogen taken up by the environment before it becomes acidic, and CL max N, the maximum nitrogen-based critical load. Nitrogen below the, in this gray area, represents non-exceedance, and anything falling outside of it represents exceedance, so some damage is occurring to the ecosystem. Starting with the base cation weathering rate, an important input parameter. Challenges to mapping this layer for Canada, because it is defined by soil characteristics such as soil texture, depth, and organic matter content. Canada's soil database, the Soil Landscapes of Canada, is a polygon map that has 2 main versions, version 2.2, which is from 1996, and 3.2 from 2011. There are complications with using version 3, which is mostly only for agricultural regions, which are omitted from the simple mass balance model. This leaves us with mostly version 2.2, which is fine because soils don't really change, but the data it was digitized from is even older, and some of these polygons cover quite a bit of area, like some are larger than some European countries. So instead, I've been using global continuous rasters produced by Tom Handel et al., now part of the Open Land Map project, which are 250-meter rasters of soil characteristics informed by both Canadian and global observations. Sorry, I hear quite a bit of echo. Is everyone else okay with the volume? Oh, it's gone. I think using these layers has great potential for harmonizing critical loads across North America. For Canada, the National Forestry Inventory has contributed their soil data to these global maps, so there's Canadian-based observations going to them as well. For this version of the critical loads, the soil texture approximation method from the CLR TAP mapping manual was used, where you use the soil, clay, and sand composition adjusted for coarse fragment volume, bulk density, organic material, and depth, and parent material as a class to look up a weathering rate class value from a table, which is modified by temperature and soil depth. After flattening the soil profile, the weathering rate class can be a bit homogeneous, and in many areas, variability is driven by soil depth and the temperature correction. For Eastern Canadian forest ecosystems, an estimation based on clay composition has been kind of a preferred method there for estimating the weathering rate. But since we're producing a map across all of Canada and many different ecosystems, we've stuck with the weathering rate class table. We anticipate an upcoming improvement based on including modeled site-specific weathering rates using the profile model, but we're not quite there yet. When I started this work, there wasn't a Canada-wide base cation deposition map. So I used a local version of that polymer made for the Athabasca oil sands region, and a wider crustal materials map to create a relationship between the two, including temperature and precipitation. You can see this map is greater in the oil sands. It's not that great in eastern Canada, and is likely inflating values there. But luckily, just the other week, Paul and his team handed me a very cool model-based cation deposition map. And I haven't included it yet, but I hope to check it out very soon and hopefully include it in the final calculations. There are two nutrient uptake maps that represent the base cations and nitrogen removal from the soil through uptake by vegetation and permanent removal through harvesting. Rather than use a blanket value, I made use of 250-meter National Forestry inventory maps available in Canada and the U.S. tree chemistry database to determine uptake values on a site-by-site basis. I built a script that looks at species composition and base cation and nitrogen content for each tree species by component, and also using the biomass estimates to calculate the total uptake. An assumption was made that biomass and species composition were related, however, that's not certain. And some other assumptions were made that harvesting includes removal of trunk bark and stems, omitting foliage, but that's probably a bit of a simplification. And these regions were trimmed to harvestable regions boundaries. Oh, sorry. And moving on to the chemical criteria for biological damage that we need to define before we can get to the other input parameters. It's easy to start with a comparison to aquatic critical loads, which are calculated using a value that is set to a protection limit for a key fish species. For terrestrial ecosystems, we want to define that damage for vegetation, generally trees, and in terms of growth or biomass impacts. What is commonly used is the base cation to aluminum ratio, which describes the relationship between base cations and aluminum in the soil. That is when soils become acidified, the aluminum concentration rises, and that has detrimental effects on growth. Note that in setting this ratio, we have to agree on what is considered acceptable loss of growth. Historically, like a blanket value of 1 was used for the base cation to aluminum ratio. In recent years, it's becoming recognized as probably too low for many ecosystems, especially for forests. For example, Eastern Canada forests, we generally use a value of 10. I have included this growth response curve from Sverdrup and Warfingeb that illustrates that, and it's generally a difference between a growth restriction of 20% under a base cation aluminum ratio of 1 versus 5% growth restriction at a base cation aluminum ratio of 10. We compiled a table from Sverdrup and Warfingeb for the species represented in there at 5 and 20% growth restriction scenarios. And with some species presence data, we can apply a ratio that is specific to each site. We have the wonderful set of continuous species composition maps from the NFI produced via KNN interpolation at 250 meters. And we can look up what species are present and compare that to our database of base cation to aluminum ratio values. Here's a brief overview of the decision-making process at each site. You check if there's enough forest cover, and if so, is there more than 5% of the most sensitive species? If none of those species are present, generalize the genus, and if nothing has sufficient coverage, then give it a generic value based on coniferous, deciduous, or mixed. Values outside of forests were assigned values based on their land cover type using a representative species from the database. So when it's applied across the map using the NFI data for forest soils and land cover data to assign the land cover specific values, you can see there's a big difference in these maps. The 5% growth reduction on the left is much higher than the 20% on the right, which is very close to 1. So I provided the CL max S for growth restriction scenarios here just to illustrate the impact. So here you can really see two things. One, firstly, that much of the Arctic has very low weathering rate, which is not surprising given that it's frozen for a lot of the year. The other is the difference between the growth reduction scenarios. You can see that CL max S is significantly lower under the 5% growth restriction. Here I've just printed the 5% CL max N alongside the CL min N, and now we have all the maps we need to calculate exceedance. While these maps were just fun to make, they were ultimately produced in support of developing Canada's ecosystem indicator of health. As you may have seen from Amanda Cole's previous work, we are working on developing an ecosystem counterpart to Canada's Addressing Pollution Horizontal Initiative, which states that the federal government will contribute to the shared ultimate outcomes of Canadians have clean air and adverse impacts on human health and ecosystems are reduced. The ecosystem indicator component is still being developed, but these critical loads maps will provide the ecosystem sensitivity information to be used with the Adagio project deposition, which was produced for a baseline of 2010 and is going to be updated soon, so stay tuned for that. And just to give you a quick peek of what that might look like, this is what exceedance looks like with these critical loads maps under the 2010 Adagio deposition. You can see point sources in western and northern Canada, as well as some exceedance in the east. I've included our lake critical map here on top of the terrestrial critical loads on the right to show you what the ecosystem indicator map will be like. So it is a combination of the terrestrial and aquatic maps. And those were estimated using the steady state water chemistry model, and they're just shown with sulfur exceedance here. And these maps are for the 5% growth restriction scenario. Thanks very much. That's all for me.
Thanks, Hazel. We've got a couple of minutes for questions. Mike Bell has a question in the room.
Hey, Hazel, great talk. I'm curious, like, just in relation to Linda Pardo's talk, is there like a national data set of tree species growth survival within Canada that you can relate to some of these soil conditions?
Not for Canada, which I was very interested to see your report come out. And I have been wondering how I can use it for our maps in Canada.
Afternoon. So I'm going to be giving kind of my annual blitzkrieg of a bunch of different projects by a lot of great people. These aren't my projects. It's a big community of researchers all working together. And when I get to your project, if you could raise your hand real quick so you can identify yourself so that if people have questions, they can come ask you and not me afterwards. So this is updates from a bunch of us in the critical loads community. So we all know atmospheric deposition of nitrogen and sulfur have come way down from the historical highs in the 80s and 90s, and that's great news. We made a lot of good progress. But we also know they remain elevated above a lot of the levels that are protective for sensitive ecosystem endpoints, 4 to 10 times for many of these. And we've also come a long way on the scientific end since the landmark GTR that Linda led years ago, filling out a lot of the uncertainties in terms of the sensitive taxonomic groups and species and how they respond. But nitrogen deposition and sulfur remain elevated above protective levels for many of these endpoints. So we still have more to do, but we have come a long way and we shouldn't diminish that. So today I'm going to talk about 7 or 8 different projects in a couple minutes each. The first set is in advances in tree critical loads, where we're examining regional variation in the curves, the inclusion of the ozone and tabletop functions. Some of this you heard a little bit of today from Linda Pardo. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the newer machine learning critical loads that are coming out. There's a poster on that tonight. Number two is we have a working group that's been ongoing for about 5 years on characterizing uncertainty and the critical loads. Give you an update on that. We'll talk a little bit more about advances in the herbaceous critical loads to extend these estimates into areas where we have less data. We'll talk about some of the methods we're trying to develop for that. And then some of the newer modeling exercises using a model that was developed in Europe and applied to the US. And then some recent advances in the lichen critical loads and some new tools in decision support. And if I have any energy at the end of that, we'll take some questions. And these are some of these decision support tools. So the first I want to talk about is being led by Becky Dalton. Raise your hand. So we know the original tree critical loads from Horn et al. 2018, the critical loads themselves do not vary across the landscape. They vary by species, but the location of the critical load can't change with temperature, precipitation. The steepness of the decline after you exceed the critical load can, but we know the critical load itself is mathematically pinned to that value. And we know that's not ecologically realistic. We know that vulnerability must vary across the landscape based on a whole bunch of different factors. Soil was mentioned earlier. This is something we're getting to. And so as a first cut, we wanted to take the existing data set that we had, which was originally analyzed at the level of the CONUS, and break it up into these 12 or 15 Forest Service ecoregions to see, for a species that's widely distributed, do we actually detect a different critical load or even an entirely different relationship? Because one thing that we did find is there are a few species that were surprises where at the national level it was a flat relationship. And what we thought might be happening there is because we have opposing relationships in different parts of the country. And so this was our first cut. It's kind of a rough proxy. I'll talk about kind of the next levels after this. And so then once we get these curves that vary across space for different species, we wanted to understand what drives this variation, whether it's the historical rates of nitrogen and sulfur deposition might have been higher, and so you're more likely to find a decreasing relationship, or soil pH obviously is a modifying factor for sensitivity to acidification. Climate can influence the site fertility and the availability of nitrogen within the soil. Mycorrhizal associations have it's becoming increasingly clear that this plays a major role in the vulnerability to nitrogen deposition, as well as basic just life history characteristics and litter quality. So this is a collection of all the data, and I won't go through this at all, but what this is all the species that we analyze and all the divisions. And all I want you to take away from this is there are different colors as you go across the row. And what that is evidence of what we thought we might find, which is different relationships in different parts of the country. So, okay, well, what do you do with this? So what you do with this is, what Becky does with this is you put it into a nominal regression model where we're basically analyzing the distribution of shapes, the distribution of the relationships with nitrogen, and how that changes with all these different predictors. So there's easily an entire talk I could give on this, but this is just one of the snapshots that we're finding. So the nitrogen growth response does appear to depend heavily on the mycorrhizal association at that site. And so if you have a community that's dominated by ectomycorrhizal species over here, you're not going to see much of a shift in the distribution of shapes. This is green are species with an increasing relationship, flat species with no relationship, unimodal is the canonical hump-shaped relationship, or a decreaser. These communities are basically not accessing the inorganic pools, and so their responsiveness doesn't change along a nitrogen deposition gradient. But it's completely different for AMF-dominated communities and species, where when nitrogen deposition is low in an AMF dominated community, you get a lot of increasers, a lot of positive relationships. And those go down as nitrogen deposition increases towards these thresholds or levels that are more negative for the community. And you get more unimodal species dominating and even more decreasers. So the Mycorrhizal Association is playing a big role in modifying how the community responds to nitrogen deposition. Talk to Becky for more. There's like 100 other graphs we could show. One of the other advances here is introducing new stressors and mathematical representations of the relationship with ozone and sulfur. So the first is the addition of this new driver, ozone, based on the W126. Chris Novak and Jeff Herrick back there are giving, wait, did you give it already or no? Tomorrow or a poster? No, go talk to them. So also with that, as Linda alluded to, you know, in the old formulation with sulfur, we only allowed for a negative relationship. We did that because we didn't want sulfur and nitrogen to commingle and it would magnify the correlation issues between them and confuse the signal. What that ends up doing is it pushes the critical load to the minimum deposition. And, you know, hindsight's 20/20, but so in this new regeneration, we added the possibility for a tabletop function, which is shown here in blue, and the old formulation is shown in orange. And so now we have for sulfur and ozone the possibility of a flat portion that then falls off. And the third is in cases where nitrogen and sulfur are really highly correlated, our ability to really be confident about what we're looking at when we see a curve is questionable. And so we wanted to add this total deposition driver for the cases where we really can't disentangle them using this observational approach. We have a lot of work ongoing with machine learning. Nathan Pavlovic, if you can raise your hand in the way back. He'll be giving a poster on this tonight. So that first generation analysis where we split it up by ecoregion, we know is coarse. Those regions don't necessarily have any direct effect on the tree response, but they represent a collection of variables that might be different. It might be warmer, it might be wetter, it might be more fertile. But we can't really add all of those variables with this older statistical architecture because it's just too computationally intensive. It already takes about 2 months running on a supercomputer to do all the runs, and so we just can't do it. We can't add more variables under the existing architecture. So in comes machine learning, where we can have a lot more flexibility in terms of the predictor sets that we look at. And what I'm showing you here is some of the results from the first generation of work that Nathan and others at Sonoma Technology did, just running the old Horn relationships using machine learning. And I checked this date. It is dated for the future, but this is just showing the R squared of the Horn original model compared with the machine learning R squared. And we get about a doubling of the performance using machine learning. And so we like that. You know, that might help us in isolating the critical loads for some of these species. So we have some new work going on with Todd McDonald and the team. Todd, where are you? There you are. Trying to use either machine learning or Bayesian approaches to open up a wider array of analytical options. And so here's where some of these soil factors come in, Palmer drought indices, and Nathan's been doing some of this as well at Sonoma, and other variables including pest and disturbance, and those results should be ready in about a year or so. Characterizing uncertainty, there's been a lot of work here too to try to develop like a simple 5-point scale to characterize and communicate the uncertainty in the critical load database. We've come a long way. We're hoping to submit the manuscript, I'd say, in 2023, and this is just an example. We had a whole working group on that Tuesday. Was that yesterday? Yep. For the herbaceous critical loads, we're also trying to extend these into areas where we either don't have data or we have less data. So the issue with the herbaceous data set, as you can see, this is the collection of 15,000 plots. It's a non-random sample. It's not based on the FIA, so it's not a randomized sample across the CONUS that you could use to infer the sensitivity at any point in the US. So that's a problem. We want to be able to use these curves in other places, but we really can't yet. So what we're doing is we're using convex hulls where we hypothesize that if there are areas in the country, like here, that are ecologically similar to other areas of the country where we do have data, like there, how far outside of that, condition space are we? And so what we do is we use convex hulls, this is just illustrated here, where you basically take the entire data set, wrap it around a multidimensional figure, and see if the areas with no data are inside or outside of that shell. If they're inside the shell, then we think we have some confidence to apply the equations there. And if we're outside the shell, we're just outside of the data space and we shouldn't do it. So that's some of the work that we have ongoing, and Jen Phelan, who can't raise her hand, or she's online, is helping lead that. A couple more, some of the newer data sets and models using props to estimate the effects of different scenarios. This is work that Todd McDonald also has been doing for us. You can raise your hand a second time. There you go. It's a really useful analytical architecture that has gotten traction in Europe. And so we wanted to see how applicable it was here in the US. So Todd and a team developed a US props database with about 1,500 species, and then developed these different scenarios of future changes in atmospheric deposition and climate change to see what does it mean this is actually for the Great Smokies National Park that hopefully many of us will be going to on Friday. Some of the lichen updates from Linda Geiser. You all know Linda. Publication of the community composition manuscript came out late last year, and I think the uncertainty manuscript is either accepted or published. It's out, okay. So there's a kind of parallel effort to assess the uncertainty of the lichen critical loads has just come out, led by Rob Smith. And then some newer work to basically extend into the climate space, which we're doing with the trees as well, to look at what climate thresholds can you detect using these similar analytical techniques. So tools and decision support, lots of work in this area too. We had some updates to the critical load mapper that went live again about a month ago or a few weeks ago. It's essentially a user interface for the National Critical Loads database. The data layers are relatively simple. Critical loads, deposition, and exceedance. The deposition comes from different sources: TDEP, CMAC, NADP, WET, and the older CMIP IPCC estimates. And so you can overlay these with critical loads to get some idea of vulnerability in your area. It doesn't include a lot of the newer critical loads that I'll talk about in a minute. But one of the major additions was the addition of tribal lands. We met with the National Tribal Air Association, and so we wanted to incorporate those boundaries into the tool and really streamline the coding. It had been handed off from kind of contractor to contractor over the years, and it had gotten a little buggy. So it's a lot faster now. So I encourage you all to get online and check it out. But there's a newer tool on the block being led by Linda Pardo in the back called CLASS Critical Load Assessment Site that you saw some of today. And I think this is a really exciting direction because it's a lot more flexible to handle the larger stores of data that we have. Like the database on the backside of the critical load mapper is already, a few gigabytes of data or something like that. And we need to multiply that by like 100 to to bring in the tree critical loads. And so it just wasn't going to work, we think, with the old architecture. So we're trying to develop a newer architecture. And so I encourage you to talk to Linda about that. And I think this is my last, or one more slide. Support for decision makers. There's a 3-volume general technical report underway. The first one on trees came out last year. The second volume on lichen is underway now, and the third volume on herbaceous species is underway as well. And I think we're going to get both of them out next year, but we'll find out. And so next steps, one of them is to finish a lot of the work. A lot of the work I described above isn't done yet. So that's going to take us at least a couple of years, I think, to finish. And we'll provide some updates next time. But after that, we really need to consider converting everything to TDEP. And I've talked about this in the past. There's a little bit of mixing and matching of data sets when you're looking at exceedances. And so that biases some of the exceedance values that you'll see, and that's something that we as a community need to figure out. There's lots of critical loads in the National Critical Load data set that haven't been quantified in terms of uncertainty, so we want to do that. Including recruitment. This is a big one as well. Right now with all the horn curves and tree curves, we can only model the current cohort of mixed species, mixed age trees. There are no new individuals that come in. And so we need to really understand how these drivers affect the recruitment of new individuals to be able to do a multi-generational modeling. And so with that, I will stop and take any questions.
So I was thrown by your last slide when you said convert everything to TDEP. I thought that the whole critical loads structure was really based on the TDEP models, that you use that to determine exceedances. Oh, well, I may be the only one with that misconception, but maybe you could explain that.
Yeah, so as long as the calculation of an exceedance is internally consistent. If you're using NADP for the critical load, use NADP for the exceedance. Then it's fine. You can bias correct it afterwards to get the TDEP equivalent. But there are, like the lichen critical loads use CMAC, and the herbaceous critical loads use, TDEP wasn't around when we were doing that. So it uses basically a deposition data set we came up with, which is the wet depth multiplied by a CMAC derived wet dry ratio. And so if you have a different deposition data set for the critical load, people take exceedances with TDEP all the time. And so what we need to do soon is, the trees don't have that because that's based on TDEP. We need to convert the original critical loads to a TDEP equivalent. It can be done. It's just, it's been a low priority, even though it is important.
All right, thanks to everyone for being here, and thanks, Chris, for setting this up pretty great. I want to acknowledge my co-authors, some of the CLAD members who have been working on this stuff, most of the ones that helped pull data for this presentation. Before I get started on the content, though, I want to take a step back to Monday and Tuesday. And for those who weren't here, Monday and Tuesday are like the business meetings of CLAD. And it's kind of like the sausage making sessions, we like to call them. It's like where we like dive deep into the data and figure out how we're gonna move some of this science forward. Like what Chris was talking about and what this is really an output of the critical loads of atmospheric deposition science committee. And it's great to see so many future CLAD members and collaborators in the crowd, like where you're all welcome to come, join us, throw your ideas in the ring. If you need a project, Chris will give you one, and help us advance how both like we create this data and how we apply it. And so as you've heard, we have a ton of critical load data available. This is a visual like representation of different critical loads within Rocky Mountain National Park. And just basically each line on there is a different ecosystem component. We go from diatoms and lakes to herbaceous species to alpine meadows to lichens. And just like there's a lot there. And what we're doing like within the federal lands is figuring out where current deposition
is causing like harm to these different components. So in this example, you see the red line is current deposition. Everything to the left of that, we expect to be harmed by deposition. The things to the right are kind of safe. We need to know this information because a lot of federal lands are using critical loads to advance management and planning activities, including looking at new source, major modification permit review. So when there's a new pollution source, is it causing additional harm in these national parks and national forest areas? Using them for NEPA analysis, so when like oil and gas permitting on federal lands often will increase emissions as well, cause additional harm. And then just in general planning, like how much, like are with these the tree critical loads that Linda Pardo was talking about, are they reducing the amount of timber available for harvest from forested land? Are we seeing increases of invasive species in national park lands and so forth? And so we really need to get a handle on where these are, like where the critical loads are and where they're being exceeded. So what we did here is we took all of that critical load data. We needed to hit pause on Chris's advancements. It's like, okay, what do we have? Where is it? Where is it exceeded? And so here we're taking the 7 main critical load types: alpines, aquatics, herbaceous communities, herbaceous species, lichen communities, tree species growth and survival, and mycorrhizal fungi for nitrogen, and then critical loads of sulfur for surface water acidification, herbaceous species, lichen communities, and tree species growth and survival. And we're applying those systematically across the US to federal lands. And where NADP comes into this, and why we're doing this here, is as Chris was just saying, we're using this NADP data, the TDEP models that are coming out of the TDEP working group, to assess both what level of deposition we're seeing harm, and then extrapolating that to where we're seeing exceedances and expected harm outside of where we've collected data. And so we have all of these different components, have different responses, different rates of response and thresholds. And so we're using NADP data to kind of assess what we're expecting to see happen. So we took all of that data, used these standardized methods, applied it to the main, federal land areas for the Fish and Wildlife Service, the National Park Service, and the Forest Service. And so it's going to point out a few things on this slide. The aquatic data, we have the least amount of this across, in these standardized application practices. Obviously, almost all of these places have aquatic resources. We need better systematic nitrogen aquatic information to apply these better and to get more data. The herb species are the same way. If you've seen previous presentations around the herbs, the species data is very regionalized. Again, we know there are species surveys in other places, and this is a really great indicator of that we can directly ask specific regions for hey, we don't have any herb data here. Do you have species surveys? Do you have species lists? Do you have something that can help us tell you what we know? And then the tree species are kind of the same way. In the forest, the wilderness areas, that's where this data comes from. They're spot on. The wildlife refuges, we haven't been able to get that data from the Fish and Wildlife Service as easily. And then the parks, we have the main national parks have a lot of data because they've done vegetation mapping inventories, but the rest of them, the monuments and other MPS units, a little bit less so. For sulfur, the surface water acidification, again, is we have a lot of data out east, a little bit less data out west. So the forests are generally covered. They're larger areas. We have some data within them. In the wilderness areas, a little bit less so, because a lot of those smaller units are out west. And then the national parks, again, we need to figure out a way to apply what we know a little bit broader. So then, taking this, we then look at the exceedances. So where are the critical loads being harmed? This gives you, just looking at Class 1 areas. And the reason Class 1 areas are important is because they're listed within the Clean Air Act and give as those that must be unharmed by new air pollution sources. So the ones that we base all of these responses from. And so therefore, when we have data for Class 1 areas, it gives us more teeth to push back against new permits. It gives us more of a voice in the conversation of what needs to be changed. And so within this, we have almost all of the Class 1 areas. We have at least a critical load of nitrogen. So this is the 5 of 5, 14 of 21, 44 of 49. And these are the CONUS areas. We don't have a lot of data outside of, since we don't have deposition data outside of the US, it's harder to calculate critical loads for those, like Alaska, Hawaii, and outside of the coast. And then the count of them, we have the most data for the Forest Service, pretty close to for the National Park Service, less again for the Fish and Wildlife Service. We just don't have the people present to give us that data. And then surprisingly a lot within tribal lands. And then we're seeing within nitrogen critical loads, 80% of the critical loads we have are in exceedance on average across all the sites. So it's still a really big nitrogen problem. But when you're looking at sulfur critical loads, we're seeing of the 4 options we have almost 3, a count of 3 of each of them within Park Service and Forest Service lands, and only about half of those areas where we have them are being in exceedance. So the sulfur, because we've reduced it so much more, is in a lot better condition. So you saw a version of this at the end of Chris's slide. This is the step 1 in how we are compiling all of this data together. So we have these summary tables that allows a land manager to quickly find their park. They can scan through, get a sense of what critical load data we have there, as well as the current relative condition based on the range of total deposition. So in this, if it's colored red, that means the minimum deposition at that site exceeds the critical load, and therefore everything is in exceedance. If it's colored yellow, that means the maximum exceeds it, but not the minimum. So you need to do a better spatial analysis to figure out what happens. In blue, it's below the maximum critical load. So that means we don't expect harm to occur there. So this is step 1. You find your park, you figure out what's going on. Step 2, we're able to expand on that line. So if you see that there are exceedances, you can dig down into your park and figure out what's there. So this, the details don't matter again. This is a list of all the critical loads we have for Great Smoky Mountains. This goes through the alpine, the aquatic, the herbaceous species, the lichen, the trees, mycorrhizae, and soil critical loads. So we're just going to zoom in on the trees, expand out on what Linda was talking about earlier, and pull out the species list of the different trees that exist within Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Still too many to see from far away, so we're going to zoom in a little bit more. And here's the list of tree species where we see, where we have a response of nitrogen deposition. On the left column, we have growth responses. On the right, we have survival responses. The reds are all the ones in exceedance. The yellows are the ones that we've now split out a little bit more so we can see the minimum and maximum response present for each of those species. So this kind of answers Linda Geiser's question where she's asking, where along the curve are we based on current deposition? And you can see some of them have a 1%. If you zoom in on this, you can see we expect up to a 1% survival decline or a 5% survival decline based on current conditions. I've then been working closely with the U.S. Forest Service to develop these critical load summary reports. And this basically takes all this data, defines each of the data sets, how the critical loads are calculated, what the expected responses are, and then provides detailed tables of all species and all responses. And due to a combination of sickness and wildfires, which are the standard problems these days, we didn't quite get these completed for all of the units before this meeting, but they should be ready in the next couple weeks. and will be shared on the NADP website. So basically any area you want this information from, you can dive in deep, find out what data we do have and what data we still need for those areas. And so I think that's one of the keys to this is by having this standard application process, we both like set the standard for when all the new critical load data is developed, like making sure it's in a way, in an output that we can extract directly to areas of interest. And where we can easily plug in new data. So if I reach out to a manager and they say, oh, do you have any data for this? It's like, oh no, that box is empty. And so we're not just like giving a blanket email of, please send us your data. It's like, okay, if you send us your data, we will directly give you this back. And then behind the scenes, we'll plug it into these new models and advance the, like what we know already too. So it works for both of us in both ways. We're able to provide that service a lot quicker and easier than we used to in the past. It also allows more of the local and regional managers to be self-sufficient. Like right now, I'm one of 3 people in the National Park Service who know how to run these models, who know how to run these data extractions. And so out of the 400 sites we have, they'll be emailing someone who will email me and say, can we have this data? And now it's all there. And so now it's more like, okay, now we see this is happening. This says this, like it streamlines the whole process. So lastly, we're planning on taking these reports and developing more interactive maps and online databases so that this is easily updatable. We're going to link these outputs to the class tools so that when you're searching for an individual site, you see the map of it, this will be the output you get, or one of the outputs you get, kind of showing you like the statistics of what you're getting there. By transferring it to an online platform, when the TDEP maps are updated for 2021, we can just like re-extract it, upload it. You don't have to download new PDFs. It'll be on the same site, in the same place, and you can look at trends over time as well. And then we also want to integrate some of these uncertainty metrics. So when you have 1,000 critical loads listed, you have a better sense of which ones we know the most about in those areas and what and how they can best be, or which ones should best be applied or used to try to influence future management and policy. And with that, I will take any questions. And want to thank the other Forest Service, Park Service, and Fish and Wildlife Service staff who've kind of helped guide the extraction of all this data and the presentation in a way that's meaningful to them. Thanks.
Hello? Oh, hey, thanks, Mike. So I'm kind of wondering, and you said that this data will allow regional managers to kind of have this information and be able to respond more to it. And I'm just wondering, what is the typical next step for those regional managers? When you showed the chart of areas that are exceeded or close to exceeded, there's a lot of red and yellow there. Mm-hmm. So once they have this information, I'm just wondering, are they then taking it to industry to work on emission management planning, or I'm just wondering what the next steps typically are.
It depends. And I think one of the values of having these species level critical loads is that like these are the national responses, and to a data scientist, they're all important. Like the R squared is what makes them important. But to a land manager, some of these are more important for habitat, some of them are more important as a food source or for like cultural reasons. And when those ones are the ones in exceedance, when those ones are the ones being harmed, it has it's a more important issue that can be raised up a lot faster versus just the forest might be harmed. Like it gives us that specificity that we can work locally with them to get a sense of what, to like leverage that to, go out to industry, to talk with the permittee, to put on extra controls to minimize the impacts on these species of interest.
Okay, thank you.
And I feel like I kind of missed half of the explanation of this session. I'm not going to be talking about critical loads. I feel like my talk is actually a great segue into the next session. So good thing for me that we're all here in the same room. I'm going to be talking about some new work that I've been doing in central Ohio, and specifically this particulate matter deposition along an urban to agricultural gradient. So I want to start off by thanking my co-authors and kind of all of the folks who have made this work possible. Kenyon is an entirely undergraduate institution, so I get to work with some really wonderful undergraduates who are shown here. So Ansley Greider, who is in the top left here, she was really kind of the motivation and inspiration behind setting up this transect of sites. And she's now a master's student at the University of Maine. And then below her is Sadie Richards, who continued this work last summer and who traveled with me to the Wisconsin State Lab of Hygiene to do some of the analyses and really enjoyed wearing the Clean Lab booties. And then a lot of thanks to the Columbus and Franklin County Metro Parks. All of our sites are at Metro Parks locations, and it's been really fantastic to work with them. And then the Wisconsin State Lab of Hygiene, where all of the geochemical analyses were done here. I don't have those capabilities at Kenyon, so I have to be partnering with other folks. Okay. So we know that urban, agricultural, and rural activities all contribute to emissions of PM10 and bulk particulate matter in Ohio, and of course outside of Ohio as well. But this is for Ohio, the 2017 National Emissions Inventory data looking at emissions of PM10. And we can see that the kind of two largest sources here are dust and agriculture. And so in the dust, we're both seeing kind of construction dust and paved road dust, more urban activities, but also really important unpaved road dust. And then of course, agriculture being these emission sources in rural areas. And we know that different sources of PM10 are going to have very different chemical compositions, and then once they get up into the atmosphere and travel, and it's going to become this large mixture, and then can be hard to disentangle once it is actually deposited. We know that PM deposition has a wide range of ecosystem consequences, from water quality and soil health to changing the albedo of snow and snowmelt rates. And we also know that the consequences, these consequences can also really depend on the chemical composition. So this is kind of making it important that we understand the spatial and temporal patterns of PM composition. That makes it easier to kind of predict its impact. This region of central Ohio is really rapidly developing, which means that there is this loss of farmland, conversion from farmland to developed land. And so this has implications for kind of a changing landscape of particulate matter deposition. These are maps from the American Farmland Trust, and they're showing farmland lost from 2001 to 2016. And so the city of Columbus, we're really seeing a lot of expansion in the suburbs and this loss of farmland. This is only going to continue into the future. I'm sure you all have heard about the new Intel factory, and this is the exact region that this is happening, right? So just east of Columbus is where the construction is currently taking place. This is great for my home value, but it also means that there are going to be a lot of changes in terms of kind of the sources and types of particulate matter, because I think that really that kind of urban area of Columbus is going to come out and kind of engulf that, that site. So my group at Kenyon, we are interested in kind of understanding this changing landscape of particulate matter deposition in Ohio. And so we're interested in kind of characterizing right now, how is this, kind of what is the landscape of bulk particulate matter that's deposited at both urban and agricultural sites, and how are their geochemical compositions different? We're also thinking about how lead isotopes can help distinguish between urban and agricultural particulate matter in central Ohio. And then finally, I'm not going to be talking about this today, but ultimately we're interested in learning about the seasonal and spatial patterns of particulate matter deposition and sources in central Ohio. Okay, so there are kind of three different aspects of the methods that I want to highlight here. And the first is really thinking about this use and the strength of having a urban to agricultural transect. So on the left, you can see, just kind of for reference, these are the 5 active NTN NADP sites in Ohio. And the little pie charts are the land cover use right around those sites. And what you can see for the NADP sites is that, as NADP NTN sites are located right in kind of a more regional background, non-developed land, we're seeing high percentages of agriculture and forest around those sites. That's just a contrast with our sites that are going from Kenyon College, that's the KC site, right into the heart of Columbus. And so in Columbus, that site is almost 90% developed, and then you can see this gradient out to Kenyon College, which is less than 15% developed. And at these sites, this is a very kind of low-tech approach here. We're just doing passive bulk particulate matter collectors. This is a modification of a marble dust collector. And over the course of the 2021 and 2022 summers, we were collecting weekly samples at these sites. Those samples are then filtered, and so what I'm going to be presenting about today is the chemistry of those filters. So we take those filters, and then after a complete digestion, these are analyzed for 55 major and trace elements with ICP-MS, and then also for lead isotopic composition with a multi-collector ICP-MS. And for the lead isotope composition, what I'm going to be doing is showing kind of a comparison of our values to the North American atmospheric trend line, which Sean Scott developed in a 2021 paper using NADP and TN samples. And this is, so lead in our atmosphere now is kind of sourced from industry and coal mining and smelting. And what's found is that these isotopic signatures tend to follow along this trend line. And then kind of deviations from that trend line can be helpful in identifying sources of lead from elsewhere, or differences in the sources of lead. The final aspect of kind of the methods that I'm using in this work are back trajectories. And I've been using the stochastic time-inverted Lagrangian transport model, or STILT, which is a modification of high split that gives a more kind of statistical footprint of where air parcels are coming from rather than individual back trajectories. So from each of the collector sites, I tracked air parcels back 24 hours from the collection site repeatedly over the week where the collection was happening. And then I filtered those back trajectories for anywhere where the air parcels passed within half a meter of the ground surface as a potential source of particulate matter. And so you can see one of the outputs here. So for each week at each site, I have a map then of this kind of footprint of potential particulate matter sources. And this then can be kind of used in conjunction with some of the geochemistry results. So to get into the results here, kind of what I want to start off with, and this is a robust finding from both summers, and potentially not that surprising, is that the urban site receives the highest particulate matter deposition. And what's interesting here, I think, is that it's really a sharp drop-off between the urban site and the other sites. We're not seeing kind of a gradient pattern. All of the kind of suburban and rural sites are very similar. Once I get into these next questions, I will admit to you that you are seeing a little snapshot into very preliminary work that I've done on this large data set that I only got a few weeks ago. So I am in the kind of exploring the data phase, and if folks have ideas for analysis or ideas of where I could take this, I am all ears. But this is kind of my first little findings that you all can see. So in terms of the geochemical composition, right off the bat, we can see that the urban particulate matter is really high in calcium. And this is not at all surprising, and it was an expected result because we really see that in the liquid chemistry as well. We analyzed the liquid fraction as well. And this urban particulate matter, construction dust, road dust, it's really high in calcium. And if you're interested in learning more about what this calcium is doing to the pH of the precipitation, so thinking about kind of what's been dubbed this urban scrubber effect, come check out Ansley's poster this evening. I'm going to be presenting it for her. Another thing that I wanted to look at quickly, and kind of one of the first elements that I wanted to look at was phosphorus, because I have a, I don't know, special affinity for phosphorus. I like it. I think it's, you know, nitrogen gets all the attention. But you can really see that there is this gradient here from the rural site and the more agricultural sites to the urban site. And this is a little bit more of a gradient that we're seeing here with the lower phosphorus concentrations in the urban site, and then a lot of variability out in the rural, more agricultural areas. I'm not going to do this for every 55 elements. Instead, here is a principal component analysis just of kind of 9 of the most major elements that I've had a chance to look at so far. And what we can see here is that using this principal component analysis, PC2 seems to be really kind of separating our sites out along this transect. And that PC2 is really dominated by calcium and magnesium on the urban side and phosphorus on the rural agricultural side. We're also seeing these kind of suburban sites fit in the middle, which is interesting because in other cases, they're just kind of falling down with the rural site as well. So I think this is really, I'm really excited about these results, and I'm excited to see what's going to happen when I add in a lot more of these elements, including a lot of metals. So now to turn to the lead isotopes. First off, just to start with the concentrations, the urban samples have the highest lead concentrations, and then we do see another kind of drop off, more of a threshold response. In terms of the kind of comparison to this North American atmospheric trend line, the urban site has the greatest deviation from that trend line, where the rural samples are closer to the trend line that has been established. The urban samples also are very, very closely kind of, it looks like maybe the lead is all kind of very similar sources coming to that urban site. What this is telling me, at least, is that there are definitely multiple sources of lead here, and it is not just kind of a regional signature that we're picking up across all of these sites. So this is something that I want to keep thinking about, definitely. And one thing that struck out to me here is this wide variability at the Blendon Wood site in terms of the lead isotopic signature. So I wanted to dig into that a little bit more. So just to kind of point out where this site is located on the map, this is a site that is located basically right along the kind of outer belt of the city. So it's right where there's this transition from developed land into a lot of farmland. And if we take a look at the deviation from this trend line, it correlates with the concentration of lead in our samples. So when there are lower concentrations of lead at this site, it seems like the signature is more like rural sites, this isotopic signature. Whereas when the lead is higher concentration, it seems like the lead is more similar to the urban site. But you see this kind of potentially, because this site is located right on the edge, sometimes it gets more of the urban signature, sometimes it gets more of the rural signature. And to bring in the back trajectories here, There is also a correlation between the concentration of lead in the samples, and thus that kind of isotopic signature, and kind of where those potential sources of particulate matter are. So just to give you kind of two extremes here, when we have really high concentrations of lead, a lot of that kind of those potential dust or particulate matter sources are from developed land use. So this is a week where kind of 43% of those potential sources were coming from developed land. On the other hand, when there's low concentrations of lead at the site, that was a week where there was especially kind of low potential sources of particulate matter coming from developed land. And I think it might be easier to kind of visualize that these back trajectories look different between these 2 weeks. So this is what this back trajectory map looks like when there was low lead concentrations and the lead isotope signature looked more like the rural sites. You can see there's a lot of kind of air parcels coming from the northeast and generally more east of the site. And then this is what the week looks like where there was very high lead concentrations and the lead isotope signature looked more like the urban site. And right around the site, you can see kind of a higher footprint, a larger footprint that's coming from the southwest. And that, relative to this site, is where Columbus is located. So it looks like these air parcels are moving kind of over the city and being deposited at this site. This is just a little bit of a kind of showing you the direction that I'm hoping to go with this in terms of bringing together the geochemistry, the lead isotopes, and the back trajectories. But clearly, I have a lot of kind of more work to do to kind of figure out what story this is all telling. So just some initial conclusions, that this urban and agricultural particulate matter has very different geochemical compositions, and this is especially kind of different in calcium and magnesium and phosphorus. Calcium and magnesium compared to phosphorus have very different ecosystem consequences when they're deposited. And just a shout out for phosphorus to receive more attention in terms of research in atmospheric deposition. And then the urban particulate matter has high concentrations of lead, and it has a very distinctive isotopic signature. I think it's interesting to look at the suburban site that has this very kind of potentially receiving this varying degree of urban lead. And I think this combination of geochemistry, isotopes, and back trajectories can be a really powerful tool. So I'll leave it there and see if there's time for questions.
Yeah, for your favorite element, phosphorus, you might consider the fact that suburban areas do a lot of fertilizing of lawns and things, and there's a lot of P there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that it'll be interesting to look at the timing of that as well, because there are some weeks in June when these values were really high, I think corresponding to when fertilizer was applied, either, not just suburban fields, but also all of the corn and soy fields that are in that area. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Thanks for this great presentation. I'm very curious to know, how did you select your urban sites? So what are the characteristics that you considered here in this study for your transect sampling? And my other question, did you consider the back trajectory simulations or results in your site selection? Thank you.
Yeah, that is a great question. So we ended up choosing these sites really through this partnership with the metro parks, in that there were sites that kind of followed this gradient, and so all of the sites are located in metro parks. What that means is that the collectors are not right adjacent to a road, for instance. They're in, they have a bit of a buffer, because these parks, a lot of these parks are, or the exact sites where the collectors are located are mostly kind of restored prairies. And so I think it's good that these are not located directly next to a road. I think I would love to expand this network to, right now we're really only looking at this one trajectory from the center of the city northeast to Columbus, or to Kenyon. And so there are many other metro parks that I would love to expand into. It's also a matter of what we're capable, how many sites we're capable of getting to each week. But I think some of the back trajectories could help me select future ones. Yeah, that's a great idea.
So your dust collector, it was just a total dust you were getting in the atmosphere. So do you have any sense as to the size distributions here of the particles that you're looking at and capturing?
That's a great question. I don't have a sense of the distribution. There is a kind of millimeter filter, so I'm not capturing large vegetation particles, right? So we're trying to keep out that. And I think that understanding the size distribution would be great. In the future, yeah.
A millimeter is a big particle.
It is absolutely a very large particle, right? And this is, we're interested in this kind of bulk deposition in terms of, ecosystem. A large particle can still have a big ecosystem impact. So it's a different approach to only focusing from a human health perspective on PM 2.5 and PM 10. But yeah.